continue with the presentations on DFSee. Where we left off yesterday, today I'm going to talk about two different topics. Partitioning, so I'll show some MBR partitioning, the classic way, and show a little bit about the GPT partitioning. And after that I will show some basics of several file systems to show you how they look on the disk. And I'll show some stuff with that in DFSee as well. What you see running here is ECS 2.2 running in VirtualBox. As a matter of fact, I mentioned those USB sticks yesterday, and that it's able, the boot manager that's on there is able to boot several ISOs. But what you see right over there, this is the contents of the memory stick that's plugged into the Mac. You see there's a menu file. I need my glasses to read the keyboard. It's getting worse every year. Oops. Where did it go? There we go. Okay. All right. This is the file. What you see there is that the first two. This used to work. There it is. The first two entries here are the ones that are visible. The rest is commented out. But you see here the first entry, boot free DOS run DFSee, and then select option blah blah blah. So this is going to be on that menu line, and it's going to boot my DFSee DOS ISO file, which you have to copy onto the memory stick. And this is the second one. It's part that mentioned Linux, and it will use this ISO. And there's quite a few others here, like the Ultimate Boot CD and other stuff that you can put on there. And if you remove the comment thing, I'm not sure how it's commented actually. Never mind. But you can uncomment them and just make them visible on the menu, and then you can boot other stuff on the same memory stick.
So when you plug it in into your regular machine, it comes up as a dot, like a regular drive.
Well, yeah.
Where is that file?
Actually, if you go into back here. No, this is more about VirtualBox than it is about. Oops. This is the VirtualBox stuff. So if you go to, this is my development machine, you go to its settings, and then you go to ports, USB, then you can see that there's two types of memory sticks more or less registered. It's got some kind of filtering on the USB identification stuff that's in every USB device. And if you have got a new one, you just plug it into the Mac, and then you go right there and say plus, and then it will show whatever is plugged in, and you can click that one, and it will add it to the filter for this particular VirtualBox machine, the VM. And then if you plug it in, it will actually capture it right away. So it will not be visible in the Mac because it has been taken by a VM exclusively. And actually, if you do it while OS2 is running, you see just the usual stuff popping up, that it's detecting the drive, and that it's assigning the drive letter, and then etc.
I know inside of OS2 it comes up as like the C drive or whatever, and then it's just a FAT file that you're editing. What's going on there with the file system?
Well, whatever's on the memory stick, and in this case that's a FAT16.
Right. But this is a memory stick you create, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it has a
FAT32 file system. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And on the guest VCS system, is it actually going through the USB driver?
Yeah.
Okay, so
it's just USB, it's USB pass through. Works very well. So if you have to eject it, then you have to go into the VM and eject it there using the ECS stuff, and then after that, either one or two things can happen. Either it becomes visible in the Mac and you have to eject it there as well.
Okay, I see.
Or it's gone all together, and you can just pull it out.
All right.
I'm not sure exactly when one of the two happens. Sometimes it's one, sometimes the other. Okay, that's how it works. style. Okay. So there are a few VirtualBox. I also have a DOS version that just attaches to the DFSee ISO file, and if I just start this one, hold on, let's not right away.
Okay.
I'll start it right over here, of course. Why not? There it was. It's already. It's so fast. It's already up and running.
Yeah.
But this is DOS running now, and the DOS version of DFSee,
Mm.
and it has its own virtual disk with. Actually, there's two disks here. You can see there are two disks, both partitioned using the MBR style. This is the one that's booted from. Actually, no, it's not even booted from it because I attached an ISO to it, so it's actually booting from CD-ROM. So it's a virtual PC, but it has a CD attached virtually,
Yeah.
and that's what it's booting from.
Yeah.
But I could also boot from this C drive because FreeDOS is installed there as well. And this is the second disk, and you can see there's JFS partition on that. And I could actually go into that using DFSee, even while it's DOS, you know, just like you start DFSee from a CD-ROM or whatever. Okay. Let's get back to the presentation. Oh, of course, same thing goes for the OS2 version. If I just go into there, get out of that one, go to that directory. There's some files over there. You can see, and those are actually result files from the DFS disk procedure that I mentioned yesterday, I think, which is a sort of an information gathering thing in DFSee that generates 5 or 6 files. Which both in human readable and binary form describe most of the interesting stuff on the disk. And I use that a lot to get information from clients, and then you can actually load those files into DFSee, into a virtual disk, and then I can look at the disk almost as if I were on site. So that's great for support stuff. Actually, I could. This is, let's see, this is from the machine itself, for the OS2 virtual machine, but there's also a set of files here for my, my Mac SSD thing, and I can actually just enter on that. And it will start DFSee, and restore those files into a virtual disk, so you can see it happening here. And it will tell you where it came from. So this is coming from the file. I had made this a couple of days ago. And there you see the contents of the Mac disk actually. And it's just reading that from those files. But I could dig in here and everything is there except for the real data. But all the boot sectors are there, the partitioning sectors are there. It's just the data that's missing. So this is a great tool for analyzing stuff, analyzing problems, and testing recovery scripts and stuff like that. Okay, we'll get into that later, probably. Let's go to the partitioning presentation. Okay, so the subject is partitioning, mainly the classic style of partitioning using MBR style partition tables, that most people are used to, and also a little bit on GPT partitioning, which is a new style that relieves you of a lot of the limitations of MBR partitioning regarding size and number of partitions and stuff like that, other odd stuff about that. Already. Okay, why would you use partitions? Well, there are a lot of reasons. Some of them still valid, some of them less so. Disks are getting bigger and bigger. Computers are getting faster. So some of the old reasons to use partitions may be not applicable anymore, but a lot of times you want to keep things separate and be able to use disks on other systems or have different operating systems use the same information or not, so you like to separate things. Although don't separate things too much, because if you divide a disk up in partitions, then you're stuck with the sizes you choose, more or less. If one of the partitions fills up, and you've got a Windows partition, for instance, then you've got a real problem. Even if you've got a lot of free space in other partitions, it will not really help you keeping Windows running. So partitioning is not always good, and most operating systems and file systems are pretty good at managing even very large volumes these days. So. Okay, another thing that used to be important, for instance, if you were using HPFS or FAT, you had to divide your disk up if it was larger than the limit for the file system, because FAT file systems cannot go over 2 GB, classical ones. HPFS cannot go over 64 GB, and there are a few more such limitations. And if your real disk is larger, you have to cut it up in parts, partitions. And of course, if you want to use multiple operating systems on the same system, the same disk, then each operating system is probably going to need its own partition most of the time. Some stuff can be installed into the same partition. Okay, and most operating systems do require partitioning. Even when you only have a single partition on the disk, it still needs the administrative data on the thing for a partition, with a few exceptions. And one of those exceptions is called a large floppy, used on where the name came from, floppy disks, but also on USB sticks and stuff like that. And that's one of the areas that Station has a problem with the FAT32 file system. That's very common on USB sticks, and if that's not partitioned, which is optional on Windows and Mac systems, then those sticks will be usable on Windows and Mac, but not on EconStation, because it really needs a partition there to recognize and use the FAT32 file system. And the problem with that is that if you get a stick handed over from a Windows user or a Mac user, you won't be able to do anything with it without modifying the stick. It's probably not what they want. Okay, then partitioning. On most PC systems there will be NBR partitioning with classic partition tables, and what that will do is divide the disk up into a maximum of 4 areas called primary partitions. And one of those you can divide up further into logical partitions. And what you get then in that one extended container, as it's called, you can have a chain of logical partition, where each partition is its own little partition table. Then there are a few alternatives like GPT that I already mentioned, which is GUI based tables. So the information in there, there's more information. It allows for larger sizes, and it's newer, so it provides for more information that's useful in partitioning. There's also more redundancy because the partition tables are larger and the area is replicated at the beginning and the end of the disk. So if one of those areas gets damaged, you can still get the information from the other area.
On the classic partition table, the way you have it presented here, it looks like there is no limit to the number of partitions on a device.
No, there's no real limit. That's true. I've seen people having 40, 50 partitions on a single disk. It's possible. Yeah. It's just sort of a linked list, a chain of partitions.
Mm-hmm. Does that work in EconStation?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of the partitioning tools have arbitrary limits on how many partitions they will allow. Yeah. Actually, I think the limit in DFSee is something like 1,000. I think I got a pre-allocated table for 1,000 partitions.
Yeah.
I think initially when I started this out, I started with something like 50, and then one of my clients ran over that. I don't see my 50/50 partition.
Yeah.
Okay, the GUI ID thing is unlimited because it's sort of an array of information on each partition, and the size of the total area is configurable. So it's and actually, if you've got a GPT system for backward compatibility, there's also an MBR. But the MBR will just have a single partition defined with a special type, EE, and it has a guard partition in it that spans the whole disk, and then the next sector will be the start of the real GPT definitions. So we'll look at that later.
Do you know us to get to those?
No. DFSee can't show them at the moment. You cannot manipulate them, so you cannot create new partitions and stuff like that. But you can, if you look at the Mac disk, well, we looked at just a moment ago. You will see the partitions inside that guard partition. There's some discussions going whether we could and how we could support GPT partitioning.
Yeah.
Because some Windows systems come partitioned this way, all Macs come partitioned this way. It's more flexible. It's also a part of the UEFI specification that the newer BIOS stuff is, so that includes GPT partitioning. It's part of the same specification actually.
Can you use GPT without UEFI? I mean, it's not direct. Can you have one without the other, or?
Yes, yes.
Because with UEFI we have a problem in general in Windows
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
If there's no compatibility layer anymore.
Exactly. But most of those will have a compatibility layer, so there will be an old-style BIOS available, so you will be able to boot. But it's not just the partitioning itself; it's also the boot sequence is different on those systems usually, because the boot code will be in specific GPT system areas, and not. They will not be part of the operating system. There will be sort of a chain loading program before that. So
from a practical view, there are systems out on the market that still have the compatibility layer, but are already using GPT.
partitioning, yeah, sure.
Okay.
I think I've even seen systems that don't even have the UEFI BIOS, but still use the GPT style partitioning.
Okay.
It's not really.
So that's even more urgent. In other words, to work on
Well,
GPT.
you can always repartition. So.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah. And apart from the Drury, you got some other stuff that's Macintosh old-style partitioning that looks a little bit like Drury GPT, but it's different. And then all Unix and mainframe stuff, they all have their own mechanisms and layouts for partitioning, one way or the other. Okay, then NBR partitioning, classic. Each disk has an NBR. There's boot code in there, which is important because the BIOS will usually go either to the first disk, or on modern BIOSes you can usually select which disk will try to boot from. But there's a boot code in there, and that will interpret the partition table, and then it will transfer control to the boot code that's in that partition, the partition boot sector. And on GPT, as I mentioned, it will be slightly different. If you do it the official way, it will go through GPT, chain loading stuff. Actually, the way to program that, you have to create a program specifically for UEFI. So it's an operating system agnostic, more or less. So it's not bound to any operating system, it's bound to the UEFI specifications. And that will eventually then start your operating system. And then there's lots of stuff tied into that specification, like things like security and trusted systems, blah blah, you know, the Microsoft stuff, and Mac also does everything to make sure that you're booting something that is trusted. Okay, then on the NBR thing, boot code will be in the active partition usually, or it could be a boot manager. This is also trickery. Your BIOS may list the disks that you have in your system if you have more than one, may list it in a different order than your operating system may label, because they could have different mechanisms for enumerating disks, and that sometimes causes problems with drive lettering or letting you pick the wrong disk to wipe clean or something like that. So be aware of that. Okay, this is what it looked like. This is the total disk, and there's 3 primary areas here. First one, second one, and this is the third one. And the third one is divided up in 3 logical partitions. This is the table, nothing to it. It just has a start and an end and a size information. I don't think I'll just go into all the gory details, but this is the information that's in there. Actually, the start and the size stuff is coded there twice. One time in a classical way, the old way, which is called CHS addressing. That's from the old physical disk layout, where you have cylinders and tracks on the cylinder and multiple platters, and then the read-write head for every platter. And those values are coded into the partition table. But there's also a linear value coded there, so it says something like this partition will start at sector such and such, and it's so many sectors in size. And there's a problem with this CHS stuff, in that it's limited in size, extremely limited. It can only describe up to 1024 cylinders, and depending on what the geometry is, that's just a couple of gigabytes in size.
Oops. Is that largely ignored these days? CHS stuff?
Yes and no. Unfortunately, it should have been. It should have been ignored about 15, 20 years ago. Most things like Linux and other operating systems haven't been using CHS for ages, but DOS and Windows have in the beginning time, and OS2 as well.
Same is true for hardware.
Sorry?
Same is true for hardware. SCSI drives never use CHS.
Yeah. The problem is that the information is there, and tools tend to use it and check it, and if it's not consistent with the other information that's there, they'll give you a warning, or worse, if you got things like partition magic, if something seems inconsistent to it, it will refuse to do anything with your disk. And some operating systems, especially the older ones like Windows 98 or even older stuff in DOS and the earlier version of OS2, would not boot if the CSS information was inconsistent. It would simply fail to boot, because they used some of that information to find other stuff that they could have found by using the other information that's also there, but they just didn't. So yes and no.
So it's alternative, the information. The LVA is alternative to the CHS
Yeah,
stuff.
if everybody would have started using it 20 years ago, we would have a lot less problems with geometry issues with disks. Because the geometry really, what it says is something like there are some conventions on what boundaries you're going to start and end with partitions, and those rules are not really written in stone, unfortunately. And some partition tools or other stuff will check upon that, and if they're not correct, they will give you warnings, or they will give you errors or whatever. And if you change your geometry, which is really arbitrary, it doesn't make any sense, but if you change that and you create new partitions, they will be on different boundaries. So you can end up with a mixed system where some of the partitions are aligned to geometry A and some other partitions are aligned to geometry B, which is not really a problem, but tools will complain about it. So it's just a pain in the neck.
So line means that you always have to fill up a full track. You cannot fill up.
Usually, yeah. If you have primary partitions, then it has to start at the first head on the first track, and if you got, usually you have to spare room, one track spare to put in the partition table, stuff like that. Lots of conventions that you have to adhere to, and it's not really a very well written out specification. There's a lot of rules, so they're a little bit soft. Put it mildly. Okay, each partition table has 4 entries. As I mentioned, there are 4 primary partitions, and then one of them can be divided up further, and then every of those logical partitions will have its own table. Partitions have a type, it's just a single byte, so there's a value for instance, installable file systems all have type 7. The FAT file system has type 6, and then lots of others. And you can, there's a mechanism to hide partitions by changing the value. And it used to be a problem using some boot managers that if partitions are hidden, then some operating systems will not see those partitions at all and would not boot and stuff like that. And usually there can only be one primary that's really visible to the operating system. For instance, DOS would not boot on the system if there were two primaries that were both visible to it. So that's why you would have to need the hidden feature to select between which of the partitions you want to use to boot. But these days most operating systems don't really care if partitions are visible or not visible. They don't really look at that hidden bit anymore. And the BIOS will only boot into primary partitions, so you cannot really boot a logical partition directly from the BIOS. If you want to do that, which is quite possible and most often used actually, you're going to need some extra software called Boot Manager, which will be booted by the operating system, and that will pick and find your operating system and boot them. Oh, I'm the wrong way again. Okay, so this is what it looks like. The table describes the start and the end of each of those areas. That's something more about the information. So this is that linear offset that's in the partition table. And for the primary partitions, it will be the offset from the start of the disk. So for each of the partitions, this will be the offset. And the other value will be the size. So the size for each of those areas will be in the table. And this information is all in this MBR sector, which is the very first sector on the disk. If you got logical, it's a bit more complicated. There will be an offset here, which is in the MBR, and it is the start of the extended container, as it's called, and that also has a size. And in there will be, on each logical, there will be an EBR, which is called extended boot record, with a partition table, and it has an offset to this first partition and the size. And then on the second one, the same thing, except that the offset that will be there for this partition will be from the start of this, where this partition table is. But the offset to the next one, because all those things are chained, are always from the start of this container. So you see this one, this one, this one. Point to the location of the next logical partition. Yes.
It would help me to visualize this if you could explain the term offset, what that means in
the
physical
offset,
terms.
that's just the distance from the start of the disk to where a partition starts.
Measured how? In tracks?
Sectors usually.
In sectors?
Well, yeah, that depends where you're looking at, but because again, the same information is coded in two different ways. Linear, so that's just the number of sectors, and the other one is in CSS values, if applicable. But usually on the disk we use these days, the CSS values will be maxed out anyway because they cannot describe those huge sizes anymore. So.
Okay, so the offset refers to the number of the sector on which that next group of data starts.
Yes, and for primary partitions, the anchor point will be the start of the disk, so yes. Sector 0, and for the logicals, the anchor point will be the start of this container. Okay. So to find the real offset for a logical partition, you have to add up this value, this offset where this thing starts, and add the second one to it, and then you know where.
Plus the size, then.
Sorry?
It's the starting point plus the size of the one before.
No.
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 That's what makes it interesting. It's a little odd.
Yeah, it's a complicated.
You sum up
It's more complicated than it needs to be, but it's
Yeah.
it's the way it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any Is there
Well,
any
if they're-
history as to why they chose to
Sorry?
do that? Is there any history why they chose to do the offsets that way?
No.
Or is it just because?
Yeah, no idea. It started out in the DOS, when DOS started using partitions on the disks getting large, because originally the disks were something like 5 megabytes or something.
Sure.
At some point they were getting larger and needed partitions. And then just like the memory stuff, they said, okay, all everybody's going to need is maybe 4 partitions on the disk, and then at some point that was not enough, and then they invented something new. So,
Yeah.
that's the way it goes.
Isn't it possible for the logicals to get out of order eventually by deleting partitions and recreating them in a different order?
Well,
Well,
yes.
to find out-
That has core
It
interest.
depends on your tooling. There's some there's some conventions like stuff. If you got all the logicals, they will have to chain, and usually the chaining, so they're pointing to each other, is in order of their position on the disk. However, because the information is all there, you could also link back to a logical partition. So if there's a hole in there and you create a new partition, it could just point from the last one and just point it back into the hole and create a new partition there.
Can you have
And actually
negative-
some Linux partitioners do that. And most other tools and operating systems will choke on that and will say, okay, this is totally broken, we'll not use this disk. So yeah, it can get messed up pretty much.
So can you have negative offsets? Negative values for the offset, or is the offset always positive?
Well, because the offset is from the start of the container here, if you link from this one, you could put an offset in there that's something like this, and it will point right there. So it's not a negative offset because it all relates to this position.
Oh, okay.
So it will not really be negative.
The math works no matter what you calculate your base of your offset is. It's just a convention.
Yeah.
And what happens is certain partitioning tools says, wait a minute, this doesn't look what I would create. It's perfectly logically consistent, but it doesn't look like what that tool would create, therefore it assumes that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you find stuff like that, DFSee will give you warnings about it. It says something like backward linking, and there's a cleanup command in the menu and also as a command that will actually rewrite all those tables to make it a linear chain of partitions again. Okay. So this is what it looks like more or less for each partition. So there will be an offset and a size, and an offset for a partition and a size, etc., etc. And in each partition table for logical, you'll find 2 things. The first one is the offset from that point to the actual partition where a file system is for the logical partition. And the second entry, that's what we call the pointer, the offset to the next logical. And only on the last one, you'll see that there will only be an entry for the partition itself because there is no link to yet another logical. So the last partition table will only have a single entry, while all the others will have 2. One for the partition itself and one for the link to the next one.
Question, please. What are the values? They're expressed in what form?
Well, the same as with the primary partition tables, they're expressed as an offset, so how far
But
into the
a
disk.
number, what kind of a number? These are all
How many sectors?
No.
Oh, there are numbers in sectors, and the size of those numbers are 32 bits, so you can address up to, if you're addressing sectors there, you can go into 4 gigabyte. No,
Sector.
no,
2 point something gigabytes.
2 terabyte.
That's just the linear value. The
Yeah.
other value is CHS.
Yeah, and that's maxed out way
Yeah,
before that.
but that's just got special values that are pretty large.
Okay, then apart from the actual tables, at some point in the OS2 development history, IBM decided that they lacked some information there, that would like to have some more flexibility in several areas, one of them being assigning drive letters freely, because back from the old DOS days and also Windows and stuff like that, there was an algorithm that would actually assign drive letters to partitions based on their position on the disk and being primary or logical, whatever. And everybody adhered more or less to the same rules, so drive letters would more or less stay the same between operating systems. But it was very inflexible and could lead to errors. So one of the reasons they added more information is that they wanted to assign specific drive letters to specific partitions freely and be able to change those if you want. Windows had the same problem, so Windows NT or later had also a mechanism to do that, but instead of putting it on the disk in an extension to the partition tables, as IBM chose to do, they decided to put it into their own operating system administration, and they put it in the registry. Where else? Everything is in the registry in Windows. So on Windows NT and upwards, including Windows 7 and 8, you can still assign drive letters to partitions, but they will be registered in a different place. Meaning that if you got 2 or 3 Windows installations on the same disk, they may use different drive letters for the same partitions, because it's just an administration internally to Windows. With LVM, IBM introduced an addition to the partition tables, more or less, in another sector, closely related to either an MBR or an EBR, called the drive letter assignment table, DLAT. And that adds some information about the partition, like a name, a human readable name, a drive letter, and some other stuff. And each DLAT each table, each DLAT table describes a single volume. And there's some more features that can be implemented using that. One of them is that there can be multiple physical partitions. So that really never took off the way they intended, I guess, because the flexibility offered by that was there in OS2. If you use a classical JFS system and your partition fills up, or your volume fills up, you can just create a new partition and say, okay, I want to add this new physical partition to this same volume. And LVM will do that for you. So you will have a single volume that may consist of 2 or 3 or 4 physical partitions.
I was wondering if you did that, you can't like back out of that, right?
No. That's the problem. They more or less stopped developing at that point. What they intended to do and never got into doing is having software and tools available to manipulate that stuff and not only expand on the size but also reduce it. So it's okay, I don't need this extra partition anymore. Then just move all the data into that one and then get rid of it. But that never got implemented. The only thing you can do is expand, and because those partitions could be on multiple disks, that's one of the advantages. So you could have a single volume on a system that have maybe 4 disks, one partition on each disk, and just see it as a single volume. That's one of the advantages that they used for Warp server for e-business, for instance. That was one method of getting large volumes with relatively small disks.
But adding up all these partitions, you still have the limits of the file system to
No,
access.
the file system is still limited to whatever.
So maybe that was the reason, because we have so big hard drives today that you don't need multiple partitions.
No, you don't need it for that. That's true. And also, you got a nightmare if, for instance, if you have those 4 disks, which is all one volume. If one of those disks goes bad, your whole volume is gone because the single system.
Yeah, right. Because the tools weren't for they were not per partition. They were per volume.
Mm-hmm.
So you really didn't have discrete backup in your store.
Yeah. And if you have third-party tools or other tools that are not aware of the LVM information, it can very easily break. So
Yeah, in hindsight, it would be much better if they'd done something like TDS and integrate that. Because that way your partitions, while they're logically together, they're still functionally separate partitions, which can be managed separately, fixed separately, and the whole bit.
yeah, there are lots of better ways to do it, but this is what they chose, and this is what we're stuck with at the moment. What I would recommend is never to use this anymore. Actually, since we have bootable JFS, which does not support this mechanism really, I think.
No, it does for data volumes, it just doesn't do it for the boot.
Yeah, you just can't boot from, but I just wouldn't use that. This whole mechanism is more or less tied to the system type 35, which is called an LVM volume. If you use LVM to create partitions, you'll notice that you'll have to choose somewhere between a compatibility thing or an LVM thing. And LVM is type 35, and actually the only thing really using that is the JFS file system. And you can still do that. If you choose compatibility, it will be some of the other types, like the classical installable file system 07, which you can put into an HPFS file system or a JFS, bootable JFS file system, or it can be a type 6 for a flat file system, or something like 0C for a FAT32 and stuff like that. And because you need extra information to chain all those separate partitions into a large volume, there's extra information that goes into LVM style partitions. But since it's prone to damage to the partitioning information in there, I would not recommend using it because it's a bit fragile.
And there's an LVM on Linux, is that unrelated to this?
Totally
different?
Okay. It's called the logical volume manager because they're managing volumes, but who isn't?
Yeah.
Actually,
It's not related at all.
my recollection is that LVM came out of a free source that was released that originally came from AIX.
Yes, that's right.
And
Right.
in some ways it's similar, but the difference is on the AIX where we deal with strips rather than partitions.
Yeah,
so everything's a little different.
Yeah, actually there's a close tie with the JFS as well. That also came from AIX.
Exactly.
And one of the things that LVM also does in that area is that it takes some of the administration stuff out of the file system and puts it into LVM control, like bad block administration and reallocation, stuff like that. So there's an area on that extra information that describes where the bad blocks are. And JFS check disk is aware of that information and stuff like that. But well, same as with the multiple partition volumes, that never matured really to the point that they had designed it to.
So when you're creating a partition, there's that question it asks about advanced or not. That's the thing where it puts that special type in.
Yeah,
if
it
you
has
don't-
a special type, and then apart from that table at the start with the LVM information, it will also put an area at the end, which is actually larger. It's up to a cylinder in size, a few megabytes, and it has some duplicate information for redundancy that you can recover from the stuff. And it also has areas there to administer bad sectors and stuff like that.
And if you choose the non-advanced option, you can still format the partition as JFS.
Yes, as long as
Yeah.
you're using the bootable JFS.
Right.
So
No, you can use
You
regular
use
JFS.
JFS.
Well, no. JFS could always go on any partition, site type 7 and type 35 partition.
yes, but I think it's meaning the other way around. You choose compatibility, and then format it as JFS.
You can do that, yes.
Well, you couldn't with the old JFS. I think it would refuse to format it. I think if it wasn't the type
You're
35.
right.
I
A
think-
long time. I don't.
I think you would even allow that.
It would always.
The only thing is if you want to do the spanning stuff, you have to use LVM volume
35.
If
Okay.
you use compatibility.
Because
I'm gonna have to go test that, because I can call out old JFS IFS and see, but I don't recall the stuff. I don't recall it requiring a type 35 for that JFS. It wasn't boot.
okay, I'm not
I guess
sure about that.
the reason I'm asking is so there's no real reason to use that advanced feature.
No.
Not for us.
Because you can still get the JFS without it.
Right.
Yeah, I have been using
this way.
I'm using the type 35 for a couple of years.
I mean, I usually choose the advanced because I didn't really understand what I thought you had to have JFS.
What's the time?
Oh,
Yeah.
we're at 55 past the hour, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so a little more than half an hour to go.
Change it.
Yeah.
A few years back, the documentation that was being passed out for ECS installs was always make the volumes LVM volumes. Always, when you're partitioning a disk, always make them LVMs.
No.
No.
I have it. It's on.
No, well,
right.
you're probably mixing up
I see this.
something.
Yeah.
There's the thing, compatibility volume or LVM type volume, that's one thing. What they probably mean at some point is that if you want to use Ecom Station with the disk and partitions, you have to have LVM information on it. That doesn't mean that the partitions in there are of the LVM type. It's just that each partition, even the compatibility ones, have some level of added LVM information that's being used by LVM to display proper names and stuff like that and assign drive letters. That's always there for compatibility and for the other type. But if you want to use the volume spanning thing, so multiple partitions in a single volume, then you have to use a special LVM type partition. So that's something, that's another layer of complexity that you don't want to get into, I think.
Okay, so I'm thinking about the issue, okay, so I'm going to bring up some new hard drives now. I want to use DFSee to partition.
Yeah.
Do I want them, so what choices do I need to make when DFSee
Well,
is partitioning?
DFSee doesn't use the term compatibility or LVM type, it just has a whole list of possible partition types that you want to use. And it's probably going to be an installable file system for JFS or something else for FAT32 or
Even
whatever.
before we get to that, I'm going to put, I don't know where I'm going to put, you know, ECS, I'm going to have DOS, I'm going to have Windows XP, I'm going to have Linux. So what kind of volumes do I, when I'm creating the partitions, what choices do I need to make so it could be any?
Have you even looked at DFSee to see the terms it uses?
That's what I'm asking.
What you read, there's a whole section called DFSee terms. The problem is he's using the terms and you don't understand the definitions, but you don't know the definitions for it. And we're going to go search over it until they're just words until you read the definitions.
Yeah, you just have to create partitions the way you would like to have them, either primary or logical, or both, depending on how many you have.
Yeah, what he said,
And the only thing you have to consider is that if ecom station is part of what will be on that disk, it's probably wise to add LVM information to each of those partitions right from the start, so that ECS, when you start installing, will recognize those partitions properly.
And one other thing is Windows, I believe, requires a primary partition to boot from if you're planning to go, right? Is that right or not?
Yes and no.
I mean,
There's a small portion of Windows that's initially booted that has to be on the primary partition.
Okay, so he would need one of those if he wants to install Windows.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, but and usually to keep things simple, I just create something like whatever these days 20 or 40 gigabytes of primary partition. Just put Windows in there, then everything is in that same container, the same partition. But there are also people that say, okay, now I just make a small DOS partition, a couple of gigabytes big, and I'll boot from that, and then I'll put Windows in one or more other logical partitions.
And you could do that? Windows will install
Yeah,
those
you can
logical
do that, yeah.
partitions?
Yeah, depending on your load, depending on your seat, depending
Yeah.
on where you got your Windows.
Exactly. But you could have a single DOS partition with DOS installed in it called C, and there would be some files for Windows as well that booted from a D or E or whatever logical partition. It's all possible.
Yeah, retail Windows, you can basically install it wherever you want, and you can also use it and install without destroying what you already have. Preloads, the rules are very different.
Okay, let's continue. Well, this is why, one of the reasons they did it, dynamic expansion is possible. You could add it, but only with the classical JFS on OS2. One large volume, multiple disks, drive letter and assignments don't change. That's another advantage. Sometimes if you got external disks, for instance, USB thing, you got the LVM information on there. You can either choose to assign a specific drive letter to it, and it will have that same drive letter on every system, as long as that drive letter is available on that system. You can also put an asterisk in the drive letter field for those, star, and what it will do then is it will just assign the first available drive letter. On my system, if I plug in, it will usually get the C drive letter because I never use C for OS2. So C is available, and it will assign that to the first USB thing I plug in. Okay, this is what it looks like for a compatibility volume. So a whole disk with a primary partition there will, or a logical in this case. There will be an EBR with the partition table, and in that same track, just a few sectors ahead of it, or past it, there will be an LVM information sector, VLAT, directly before the actual partition with the partition boot sector. So there's an additional sector here that together with this one and this one describes the partition, and it has the drive letter and it has descriptive names. It has a flag to signal whether it's on the boot manager menu, stuff like that.
So that EBR mechanism allowed for that gap there, so you could slide stuff
in the old conventions, the EBR area would be one track, so usually there would be something like 63 sectors or something. And the EBR itself would be at the first one, and the LVM sector is at the last one. So there will be a gap in between them. And the same goes for the NBR area as well. There's an NBR at 0, and there will, the first primary will start at 64 or something, and then the LVM information will be at 63. So, yes.
If there's more or less than 63 sectors per track, though, that moves around, doesn't it?
Yeah. So the position of this sector depends on the geometry. That's one of the things that I mentioned. Geometry is really not significant, but on the other hand it is, because that will determine where the stuff will end up. And for instance, if you change geometry and you create new partitions, it may create a new sector somewhere over there, and then there will be two that are conflicting. And one of them is not valid anymore because it's not corresponding to the current geometry. But still, if tools are looking in specific positions, so what DFSee does, if you start up, it will actually scan the first 300 or 400 sectors to see if there's an LVM sector or see if there are multiples. And then it will give you a warning if there are multiples, because then there's a problem with your disk partitioning probably, or something you're not aware of.
And at some point, at some point in time,
It can get interesting.
Yeah, at some point in time, DFSee will probably have the ability to replicate that LVM sector, because there is software that assumes that LVM data will be a certain sector.
Yeah, at 63 usually. Yeah, which doesn't. Yeah.
When you scan through, is there some sort of signature that enables you to identify it, or
Yeah.
does?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a unique signature at the start of every sector.
Not only that, it's very well protected. It's got good checks updated and all that stuff that would be nice to have elsewhere.
Yeah. Actually, one of the advantages of using those LVM type partitions is that most of the information is duplicated, and if for some reason you have the partition deleted and the information deleted, DFSee is able to find that duplicate information at the end of the partition and actually recreate the whole thing from there. So if you create the partition new, recover it, it will still have the original names and stuff like that, and the drive letter assignments, everything will still be there. But that's a small advantage, and I don't think it outweighs the disadvantages of using the LVM type 35. Okay, this was a simple one. There's more. This is the type 35. So what you see there is the same thing. There's an EBR, there's the LVM-info thing, and the DBR. So this information altogether. But then, apart from the partition data, which is in the partition itself, at the end of it there will be the what they call the LVM signature area with the bad block relocation stuff and drive linking information, and that's a couple of megabytes in size.
That's if it's a type, whatever that is, 35.
Yeah, type 35, yeah. And all the other types are called compatibility.
And do other OSs like this?
No.
They might wipe, not this internal stuff, but that other stuff, the first LVM green thing.
This one?
Like, does Windows observe that and not touch it? Or it can
No.
cream it? Or
Well, yeah, by convention they will leave it alone, but
okay.
Maybe.
no guarantees.
Maybe.
It's like the Geneva Convention. Huh?
Well, for instance, in the same area, if you go into the MBR stuff at the start of the disk, this same area that's sort of reserved is also used by the Airboot manager, for instance, to install its code. But it's small enough to allow for room for the LVM.
Well, Airboot's okay because it does respect it, because it knows that it should be there, so it knows not to overwrite it.
But there's...
But to give you an example, I have a friend who insists on using partition magic, partitioning. And he also insists on using FixPack 10 for some of his disk, or some of his OS2 install. He's eccentric. And he shows up at our SCOA meeting with a disk that a drive that we'd installed for no longer booted, for the obvious reason. He added 6 partitions using partition magic.
Yeah, exactly.
And it properly wiped out that data. Because it writes zeros there, FCs there, I forget what.
Yeah, there's more possible problems with using other tools. So one of the things is that, let's go back to the previous one. If you look at this gap, some of the Linux partition tools thought, okay, that's all wasted space, let's just put the EBR and the partition boot record close to each other and reduce that gap to 0. It's possible. I mean, the partition still works and is visible, but there's no room for LVM anymore. So And actually, if you do that and just use the LVM program, it will just say, okay, the geometry is something like 63 sectors, so I'll just put the LVM information 63 sectors past the EBR, which is in the middle of your data. And it will do that. It usually doesn't do much harm, but you never know what you're going to overwrite, but it will be inside of your Linux partition. And probably hurting something. And so DFSee also gives you a warning about that. It will say, okay, there's no room for LVM information. And if you use DFSee, it will not create it, but the LVM program itself on the incrustation will.
So you get into that trouble if you allow Linux to create your partitions for you?
Yeah.
But sometimes even if you don't allow Linux to create the partition.
Yeah, they'll just do it anyway.
Start overlaps.
Yeah, some of the Linux installers actually just install to a logical partition that you already created there because you know how you want it. But we'll just say, okay, well, we never know. We'll just create new and rewrite the partition table so we know it's Linux compatible. But at the same point, they probably move the EBR to a different location because they think it's more convenient for them, overriding LVM information in the process. So that's why I would stay away from most Linux tools because you never know exactly what they're going to do because they're not very aware of, well, maybe aware, but they're not. They don't really care about other operating systems.
When this system, I created the partition with and then install Linux into it.
Most of the distribution will actually use it. If you create it before with DFSee or something else and everything is the way you want it to be, then if you use the installer in advanced mode or something, you can just say, okay, I want you to install into that partition and I don't want to touch anything. Most of them will do it, but some don't.
Even some in advanced mode, they muck it up. Well, it's you can understand their point of view. Your target market is folks that are not much smarter than Windows users. They don't understand partition, so they just do something that'll work.
So what's the solution for installing Linux? On certain distributions you can install it?
Simple. Don't use the Linux, just what he said. And he said, don't use the Linux partition.
Yeah.
And
Try to avoid having Linux doing anything to the disk except installing their code.
Okay, so there's a differentiation and you have a choice, like telling you not to format.
On most distributions you have a choice. On some distributions it's hard to find, on some distributions it's simply not there.
So
They just install the way they want to install.
And how would you know beforehand?
Don't.
Ask.
You have to look around on.
Or you can know beforehand, like Red Hat, for example, and the things that are copies of that, it's pretty clear when you're installing, you better pay attention, but you can make those choices and say you want the advanced option, you can go in and do all that stuff. It's pretty clear.
It comes up in the installation process.
Yeah, and then it'll just use the partition that's in place already and not do any of these things you're discussing.
David, what John is saying, what we've seen is every now and then, there's a couple of Linux installations, because they're all a little different, that will actually, in advanced mode, rewrite the partition table because it knows better than you.
No, I've never had that
Even
happen.
advanced, no.
I had a few times.
I would expect most of those have gotten changed by now, because people have got to complain when it screws up multi-boots.
Are there any recommendations, Linux, that works okay?
I use CentOS, that's very nice, it's free and it's a
I've been
copy.
using several like SUSE or Ubuntu. They usually work well enough. I don't do much with Linux.
Could this happen from version to version that it changes?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
If possible, try to stay away from the very latest grub implementations. That's boot manager. There's a new generation, grub 2, I think it's called. It's even more complex than the previous version, and it's less compatible with other operating systems. It's very tricky. It doesn't respond well to moving stuff, and because actually when configuring grub, the boot manager on Linux, it will find stuff that it needs to boot, and it will record those exact physical locations into its own administration. And when you start moving stuff, it does that up, and Linux will fail to boot and stuff like that.
So they're going the Windows way then?
Yeah, more or less. They just assume we own the world and we'll just put it in our administration and everything will be fine. They don't really care about anything else outside.
They
their
really
point of
don't deal with multiple OSs.
Okay, let's continue, otherwise we'll run out of time too quickly. LVM information, news by compatibility and other ones. Drive letter assignment table is IBM name. There's some generic info in there, like disk geometry. Oh, that's one of the things you may want to be aware of if you clone a smaller disk to a larger one using DFSee. So you do a disk-to-disk clone, or with any other tool, doesn't really matter. It will clone anything, everything that's on the disk, including this LVM information. And because the disk geometry is in there, it means that if you look at that disk again with DFSee after cloning, even when you clone the 100 gig to 500 gig, it will still say, okay, this is a 100 gig drive, because that's what's in the LVM information. And for DFSee, the LVM information is leading with regards to geometry and disk size. So it doesn't really listen to what the operating system says it is, because the operating system probably knows it's a 500 gig drive. It will still say, okay, no, this is 100 gig. So what you have to do at that point to make the extra space really available, because that's probably why you clone it to a larger disk, you have to go into the LVM part of the DFSee menu and set a new geometry that is for the full size, and then write it back. That there's a description of that somewhere in the help how to do that.
Can you figure out the details so that we don't have to get out our calculator?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's an automatism to
Yeah, what you actually do is you tell DFSee through the menu, do not use the LVM information for the size, but use the operating system information, and that will set a new geometry that's for the disk. And then you tell it to write that information into all the LVM sectors that are on the disk, which could be dozens of them. And all of them have to be consistent.
The menu entry called set LVM geo to DFSee logical geo.
Sorry?
I'm just looking at DFSee.
Yeah.
It's set LVM geo to DFSee L geo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And before you do that, you have to make sure that I think that's in the edit menu somewhere, where it says to use or not use content-based sniffing or something.
Ooh.
I think it's in the edit menu. Because that's what I mentioned yesterday. By default, it will look at the partition tables and LVM information to determine what geometry to use and what the size will be.
And you tell us not to do that?
Well, then usually the result will be the same because
No, but I mean in this case you're describing where you...
Yeah, then you have to, Okay. This is the extra information that's in the signature area at the end of the partition. Let's not go into all the details there. It has bad block relocation and drive link data. Okay, this is what it looks like again for primary partitions. So you see an NVR with the LVM at the end of the first track, and the gap in between them. It could be anything there, usually it's empty, but it could be a boot manager or something. And then the primary partition, and here another partition with LVM signature data. So this is an LVM type partition, and this is a compatibility one. This is what the whole thing looks like then if you got logicals. NVR here with the table at the end of the first track, then there will be some primary partitions. And all those primary partitions will be described in the same sector. So one of those tables can describe up to 4 partitions, just like the partition table itself in the NVR kit.
Doesn't that also contain the disk name?
Sorry?
Doesn't that VLAN also contain the disk name?
Yeah, disk name. Yeah. Disk name, and there's some checksums in there as well, and geometry and stuff like that. Compatibility volume, primary, LVM type primary with signature area, and then the same thing again for logicals, but each has an EBR, and with every EBR there's a DLNT associated with it, the logical, and same thing again with a JFS type partition.
Question, you're not talking about HPFS anymore. The new installs are all...
HPFS is just one of those compatibility type of things. It's an installable file system, can go into a type 07.
HPFS is what you put inside the partition.
Yeah.
It's not the partition itself.
Exactly. All in this data area will hold a file system that could be FAT, NTFS, HPFS, JFS, whatever. except that with integration with this stuff, you really need JFS because that's aware of that extra information that's there, the other way around. LVM is aware of JFS. Okay, I think I will skip this. It's not really that important anymore, but there are some limitations with it, and as I mentioned before, you'll get some warnings and some tools will complain, but usually it's not a big problem. The only thing that's being influenced by CHS is where things are positioned, and that may cause you problems once in a while. This is the major limit. There's another limit for OS2, by the way, also a cylinder limit. That in the CHS thing, there were 10 bits reserved for the cylinder number, which restricts you to this number, 1024. In OS2, in the kernel and some device drivers, there's also a limit that the cylinder number should be a maximum of 16 bits, which restricts you to 64K, 65,000 cylinders. And with normal disk geometries, that will limit you to a disk of 500 gigabyte maximum. And there is a way around that, more or less, by using non-standard geometries with a huge number of heads over the normal limit of 63. And you can bump that up to either 127 or 255, and that will allow you to use disks to 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte.
But that only works on partitions that have LVM. Remember that's where that stuff.
Well, yeah, if you want to use it with yes. Yeah. But at least that will allow you to see that whole 2 terabyte from Ecom Station.
By LVM, you mean that special type?
Yeah, the DLAT.
No.
Technically, it's the DLAT sector where that stuff goes.
No, not the special type.
Not the special.
Just the additional information.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So that would be basically on OS2. That would be any partition, HPFS, JFS, as long as then, because everything is managed by, or
Yeah.
everything has LVM-info.
Yeah, that's right. What it does is make sure that even if you are at the end of the 2 terabyte disk, the cylinder number will still be below 64K. Yeah. Yes?
Isn't it also true that the only way to get that information on there is to start with a pristine disk and let us be the first thing to see it?
Well, you could add the information later, but if you have created partitions already using a geometry with 63 heads, then they will be aligned to that geometry. So it's not really possible then to change that. Well, you could change it and create new partitions and then rewrite the geometry and all the LVM information. It will still work, but then you got some sort of a mix of old and new geometry, which will lead to warnings. It will probably work, but it's not clean. So the best way is to start out with an empty disk and make sure that all the partitions are aligned to that geometry you want to use.
What allows you to put in that information, to change the CHS?
Well, if you start with a really empty disk, then the normal Ecom Station installation tools will handle it for you. So LVM and mini LVM will actually, that's comes out of the DFSee drivers, actually, the LVM stuff. That will automatically...
What do you mean for the traditional LVM, it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah,
The best way to do it, I recommend you just describe the way to do it correctly in DFSee.
Yeah, you can do that, but let's put it this way. If you don't have DFSee, if you have an empty disk, then just installing Ecom Station or using that disk with Ecom Station will also take care of it.
Because mini LVM has basically the same algorithms that DFSee does.
Yeah, exactly.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And then if it's bigger than 2 terabytes, you just can't use the remaining part of the disk.
No. If it's larger than 2 terabyte, you're going to need sector numbers that go beyond 2 bits. And the classic NBR style partitioning will not allow that. That's one of the reasons you want to use GPT, because that has 64 bit sector numbering. And you can go beyond the 2 terabyte limit. So what you do with DFSee, and actually, well, the mini LVM does the same. Actually, you create your first partition, and it will put LVM information with that. And because it already uses the correct geometry, DFSee will do it automatically if the disk driver presents it with that geometry, which the later stuff will do automatically on large disks. If not, you can force it in DFSee. You can set the geometry manually with the command or from the menu. And then that will get recorded into the LVM information that's written to the disk. And from that point on, DFSee will automatically retrieve that and use it.
But don't you actually look at the disk size? Don't you look at the disk size? Because if there's existing partitions, we can mix and match. That's not a problem. You get warnings, but it will all work like the DFSee.
Yeah, it will still work,
but you won't be able to create partitions above the 512 gigabyte limit unless you use the large geometry.
Yeah, that's another possibility. What I did on, I got a ThinkPad with a 1 terabyte disk, and I had the choice, what will I do? Will I use it as a 1 terabyte with this special geometry, or will I just use, because Windows was installed on there, of course, what else? So I decided to restrict Ecom Station to the first 500 gigabytes. So I just used the classic geometry with 63 sectors per track, and that works. But Ecom Station will not be able to address anything over 500 gigabytes, which is fine by me because I've got a large Windows data partition beyond that, and 500 gigs is more than a need for Ecom Station, so no problem. Okay, let's continue. Wow, this is really... Because CSS is limited, you have to use dummy values if they don't fit, and there's a few different standards for how to do that. Some tools will complain if you use the wrong standard.
It's also good to know the hex value so you can tell if other partitioning tools have been in there.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to always look for, in our case, we want FFFF, if I recall.
Yeah, it's Microsoft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's something else for the Macs and it's big, you should probably do some repairs first before you start partitioning.
Okay, let's move on to GPT. GUI ID, partition tables. GUI ID is a unique identification, which is a long string actually, just numbers. It's used in lots of places in all sorts of software. And in here it's used for two things. One is to uniquely identify each partition, so those things are created on the fly when you create partitions. And the other ones is there's a GUI ID as well for each partition type. So instead of a single byte, like 07 or 35, whatever partition type, there's now a GUI ID string to describe lots of standard partition things. You can go over the 2 terabyte limit because they use 64-bit sector numbers, physical sector numbers, PSN. And they're usually embedded in an MBR style guard partition with a special type of EE. And currently you can display GPT stuff. You cannot modify it. I always fall into this old trap again. Nope. Okay, there's GPT information consists of two parts. There's a header that describes how large the actual array of information is, and there's some other administrative stuff in there, and there's a partition table array with the information, and that stuff is duplicated at the end of the disk. And in the header there's information on the position of where this partition table array is located and how large it is and stuff like that. There's another GUI ID there for the whole disk, so each disk also has a unique identification. And also there are checksums and stuff like that in there. So this is what it looks like. We've got a disk that's using it. There will be an MBR, and it's defining a guard partition that's the whole remainder of the disk. And that remainder area will have an area at the beginning and at the end that describes the GPT partitions.
How can you have an NPR defining the entire disk if it's larger than 2 terabytes?
Oh, you can't. It will probably max out. I've never really looked at that, but yeah,
I'm
it
sure
should
it's
probably
a
just
2
max
terabyte
out.
max,
Okay.
You know, the thing is only there to prevent other partitioning tools. Like you got a disk, you plug it in, it's GPT,
okay.
and the other tool will say, okay, I don't see an MBR, the disk is empty, let's partition it.
Oh,
So that's
okay.
why the garbage
So if it
is
was
there.
2 terabytes, the other tool would
Yeah, it's just-
Yeah,
It's
we'll
not
just say,
like
okay,
you can
there's
only
2
see
terabytes,
2
and it's all
terabytes.
used, so there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, it just looks like. a
That's
2
what it's
terabyte.
for.
Yeah, okay.
It's just,
So it'll still work even for its intended purpose, even if it is a 3 terabyte disk. It'll still
yeah,
prevent
exactly. It
the-
still prevents it
Yeah.
from modifying it. Yeah. From actually prevent it from thinking the disk is empty.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the same problem you used to have with all Macintosh disks that had some kind of partitioning on it. And DOS-style partitioning tools wouldn't see that and say, okay, that's an empty disk, let's use it. But it was full of Mac partitions, but just described in another format. Okay, that's what it looks like. So they're more or less comparable to primary partitions in the MBR style. I mean, all GPT partitions are created equally, more or less. There's no logical partitions in GPT. Okay, questions on that? How long have we got? Another?
We have 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes.
Well, the second part would have been something about file systems, but all the presentations are up on the website. They will be shortly, and they're on my own website, so we won't be able to get into that. I'll just quickly show some of the stuff in DFSee itself. So that's.
I have, it's not a question, it's more than an experiment proposal. I don't know if you have seen, if you have a PC with Windows,
Yeah.
and you install Ubuntu on top of it, but you use Woobi.
You use what?
Woobi. It's Woobi. It's called Woobi.
GUI.
No, Woobi. Woobi. It's a
UI.
Windows Ubuntu installer something. Woobi.
It creates a virtual drive inside of Windows that it installs Linux on.
Yeah, it's a way of doing dual boot, but it doesn't partition the hard drive. It creates the Windows hard drive as a single file inside Windows. And when you boot, you boot Ubuntu, you boot Linux from the Windows boot manager, and it loads from the hard drive image. The idea, I don't know if anybody has tried something similar with Ecom Station to try to boot it from a file inside Windows.
Grub will let you either boot off the Windows or off the Linux.
But it's Windows specific then. So
Yeah,
it's not like virtual machines.
Okay.
I don't really want to get into it. Okay.
But I would.
Reason for doing that.
Well, there's a couple reasons, possible reasons. One is somebody can test Ubuntu without having to format their drive or repartition their drive or
So
anything.
basically, they're using the file as a live CD, effectively.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we used it at work at one point. We were using the Woobi as a shoot, I can't think of the right name, but just as a I can't think of the word now.
Okay.
But I think it's a good idea for Windows users that want to try it.
Let's cut this off, please.
Okay.
And continue with this. We only got a few minutes.
Okay.
Okay. This is the OS2 version. So this is Ecom Station running here. And what we did at the start of the presentation was load a few files in there that actually show the contents of my SSD disk on the Mac. And you see the GPT partitioning there. I can't really get into that now because it's only the MBR style thing and some of the GPT stuff that's visible. Although I should be able to just go in there and say display the MBR, which is at sector 0, and it will actually show the contents of the. Oops. So this is what you normally see. So it's showing the master boot record, and there's a guard partition defined there This is the table entry, and it's maxed out on the CSS, and it has the whole disk here in linear values. So this is the guard partition, and it's decoded here. So this is what it will be. There will be a begin sector, which is the very first sector, sector 1. So sector 0 is the MBR, and sector 1 is where the guard partition starts, and it ends at the end of the disk here. So this is the guard partition. And then inside this guard partition is our definitions for various GPT partitions. It starts out with an EFI partition, a sort of a system partition, which is a FAT32 thing, I think. Oh, that's this one. 200 megabytes in size, and there's a unique ID, stuff like that, and there's a type. Same one for the next. This is where my actual operating system is installed. So this is the real OS X drive, HFS Plus thing. It's almost the entire disk, and there's a small boot thing at the end, which is probably used for recovery stuff, whatever. I haven't really looked into that what it is, but it's a recovery thing. Okay, so this was loaded from files that I just put into DFSee. If I quit that and just start DFS fresh, DFS that was 2, not create a log file. Then it will actually show the virtual disks that are attached to this virtual machine. So there are 3 disks here. There's the one that I boot from. There's a D drive, which is where ECOStation is installed. It's called ECS 2.2 USB, because I was experimenting with USB connectivity when I created this one. And there are 2 other disks attached which have my development environment stuff that I need for developing DFSee. So there's an H drive and a J drive. Originally that was the HPFS drive and the JFS drive, but since a couple of years both of them are JFS actually. But I stick to the same drive letters to keep all my command files working and stuff like that. Okay, so this we're looking with the OS2 version now, looking at the virtual disk attached to it, and actually, okay, the memory stick is inserted in the Mac right now. You see it right there. It's attached and got assigned the C drive letter, and it's a FAT32 thing with it's a bootable USB thing for DFSee.
So it's partition.
Sorry?
It's partition.
Yeah, it's one primary partition. Okay, let's see what else we got. Let's move this one out of the way. This was the DOS one we looked briefly at. It also has some virtual disks attached. Then there's another one. Just for fun, I'll show you this one too. Oops, if I can get it. This is Windows XP. And it should have DFSee installed there. DFSee. So I can just start it there. The launch window. There's another DFSee there. So this is the Windows version. They all look very much alike. Good imagine. And this shows the virtual disk that this Windows XP is installed on. So it's a 10 gigabyte disk with Windows. I think that was the DOS version. Okay, let's put the last one. This is a terminal window on the Mac, so this is just the Darwin operating system that's underneath Mac OS X actually, and that also has its own DFSee version. Which I have to start as an administrator, so I'll have to force it to use administrator stuff. So this is the Mac version, OS X 12.2, so this is actually more or less the ongoing development version. And you'll see the same, you see the SSD disk here, and you see the Okay, this is an EXFAT file system that I mentioned yesterday too, I think, which is for an SD card that I've plugged in. And this is a 64 gig one, and on those cards the use of EXFAT is mandatory. And on this thing you see the GPT disk. It has the 3 partitions that we looked at just a moment ago. But this is on the real SSD disk at this moment. You get some warnings here because, well, this is GPT. I'll give you some warnings about this stuff. Of course, on the Mac you don't need an active flag or something, and the boot mechanism is different, so this is not really relevant on GPT disks. Okay, those are just a few of the DFSee versions.
You have a warning there that the CHS begins with the...
Yeah, this one, yeah. Maybe I'll suppress those messages when it's a GPT disk because they'll not conform to anything anyway. So. The GPT display has not been in there for too long, so there's still some things to consider displaying or not displaying certain stuff. So. Okay, so far. Any questions?
You bring up 2 obvious future support issues for ECS, and one is that we need an EXFAT IFS, which I think.
Yeah, that's a bit of a problem because there's some licensing issues with Microsoft. You have to license it from Microsoft to be able to use it, and that will probably be costly.
Yeah, well, we have a mechanism for that now. But the other is the GPT. What drivers would need to be modified in OS2 to provide GPT?
Yeah, quite a few. There have been some discussions already, but you have to adapt some of the lower level stuff like OS2 DFSee, OS2 LVM, stuff like that. It has to be aware of GPT, and you have to decide whether you want full GPT use. So the best way to do this, the cleanest way, is that disk is either GPT or MBR.
Yeah.
Mixes are possible because that guard partition doesn't necessarily have to be a single partition. So you could say, I'll use that MBR thing, the partition table in there, and describe the 3rd GPT partition, which I know is somewhere over there, and describe it there as a primary, and use that with Ecom Station. You could do that, but it's tricky.
Yeah.
What facilities are for the GTP spec, for the GPT spec to recognize that funny MDR?
Well, the funny MBR is only there as a guard. I mean,
it'll basically ignore it and go to sector 1.
Well, most tools should ignore it, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of the tools say, okay, this looks like a GPT disk, but it's an MBR with multiple partitions. I don't want to touch this, or maybe they'll just say, okay, it's not a single guard partition, so then it's not a GPT disk.
Yeah, that's the thing. We don't know yet.
We don't know how other tools would react because they would expect a partition to be there type EE, and then say, okay, then it's a GPT disk, and we'll start analyzing that. But what if you put other information there? I don't know.
Yeah, and the thing I don't recall is whether the guard has to fill the whole disk. So with that guard partition, logically, it doesn't have to be special, right? It could just be a marker.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm assuming that the GPT code, it's going to go look at sector 1 and check the sector. It's not really going to key itself off the MBR.
Well, actually, the GPT header and the other stuff defines the position and the size. So that doesn't necessarily have to be the whole disk.
Exactly.
But,
you don't know.
We don't know. Right. Yeah.
You said you could display the GPT information but not manipulate it. Are you able to, say, take an image to an image file or anything?
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Okay,
so that
because that's just copying or compressing raw image data. You can.
And so then you can put it back as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I just cannot go into it and manipulate stuff, change it. But, backing it up or something, that's possible. Sure. Other questions? Okay, then I want to thank you for your attention.
Google.
EXFAT.
Google code, open source the XFAT. And it wasn't the only one, it was just that time.